From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Well, what an exciting time it is to be an Australian with the AFL Grand Final upon us.
How is that the first thing that you bring up? You're like anti-sports.
I know. Yeah.
Is this why you're spending time out of the office at the moment, so you don't have to hear, given that we've got more and more men joining who are into the AFL, like you're trying to avoid sports ball talk?
It's not just the men, it's like Anna, Mira, they all follow the sports ball as well, don't they? Or Ree? I think so. I'm pretty sure Courtney.
No, Ree's a fair weather West Coast supporter, and there's nothing fair weather at the moment about being a West Coast supporter, so she's kind of keeping herself pretty quiet at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know who's in the grand final, Jason?
Well, the grand final has yet to be decided, so there's four teams left.
Okay.
But I'll be over in Melbourne, so if anyone's got any tickets, this is actually aired after
You'll be
the
too
grand
late.
finalists. It'll be too late. Hopefully, we'll update people after this, whether I got AFL Grand Final tickets or not.
I'm going to put my money on not.
It's looking unlikely at the moment. I think I've tapped out all of my sources, so we'll keep trying. All right, look, we've got a guest, though, that's calling in from the other side of the world, so we should probably let her in and get going, hey?
Yep.
All right, great. So this person is an occupational health psychologist with expertise in cultivating healthy workplaces and supporting healthy workers. She holds a PhD from the University of Nottingham and is the Director of Postgraduate Research, Queen's Business School at Queen's University, Belfast. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Juliet Hassard.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
No, great to have you on. We love people from joining us from the UK and Ireland, so thank you for joining us today.
Julia, what podcast do you like to listen to?
Oh gosh, now that is a tough question. And I have to be honest, I'm going to give you a really, really terrible answer, which is I don't really listen to podcasts. Is that terrible?
You're definitely not the first guest to have said that, so that's okay.
Yeah, we speak to lots of nerds who just like reading books for some reason. So
Books, textbooks.
Journal articles. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not really selling myself here, am I, particularly?
What's a fantastic journal article that you've read recently?
Actually, there was a really fantastic one by Lamontag and colleagues. Actually, they're based in Australia, and it's a nice sort of editorial piece talking about a mentally healthy framework for organizations. And I think it talks about, it pulls together all the kind of key bits of evidence we've been sort of developing over the last, 10, 20 plus years to sort of say, well, what are the key practices and principles that might really populate this framework? So I think it's a really nice piece. I think it really articulates, some of the key principles, both from a research perspective, but I think more importantly for policymakers and employers. So, what are the things that you can be doing, should be doing to think about mental health in the workplace? So I think that's one that I've read recently that I thought, yeah, spot on. Really, really good.
Yeah. We had at our conference this year, we had Tony, Kat, and Angela on a panel talking about the integrated model. So yeah, it was good.
Yeah, and Juliet, you don't listen to our podcast, but Tony's been on twice.
That's it. Okay, well, I'm in good company then.
Yeah, and I must be a nerd too because I actually shared that article on LinkedIn too. So I thought it was a very good article, and I don't read a lot of articles.
Oh, you and many, Jason.
I prefer podcasts to consume my knowledge.
And we can just invite people on to tell us about their research so we don't have to read it.
Yeah, Tony is the first and only one to actually do the new format that we thought would be good with researchers, which is kind of like a 20-minute rundown of a journal article. So there's another one that he did a rundown on that was published before that one. So you might want to check that one out, Juliet.
Oh yeah, I will too. Yeah, definitely.
Can you tell us about your professional career, please?
Oh gosh. How far back do you want me to go? I mean, I suppose. I mean, my background is as a psychologist. And many moons ago, when I was, well, doing my undergraduate, probably like a lot of psychology students, I thought I wanted to do clinical. Um, and then I think as I kind of got more into the sort of training of it, became just really interested in the idea of, how do we create environments that are effectively health promoting, health enhancing? So, sort of shifting that paradigm from that kind of clinical perspective in terms of, well, what do we do when someone, needs therapeutic support, et cetera, to how can we think about mental health much more from a preventative end, and I suppose more from a community based perspective. So I think for me, that was a real paradigm shift. Being fascinated and interested in mental health, wanting to kind of spend, I hope, sort of my professional life trying to support how we cultivate people's mental health, but thinking about how I could apply that perhaps outside of kind of a clinical setting. Um, and then I think through that just became really interested in the workplace because, well, as adults, we spend a huge amount of our time in the workplace. And so it's probably one of the most influential environments that, um, as adults, I think can shape in either negative ways, possibly, but also in really positive ways in terms of our kind of health and overall well-being. So um, I think once I sort of got that into my head and that sort of interest, I was lucky enough to go to the Institute of Work Health and Organizations at the University of Nottingham, which unfortunately is no longer there, but was able to train with Tom Cox and other sort of fantastic people within the field. Um, and that was sort of the beginning for me, really, in terms of, being, not only just interested, but seeing a real opportunity, hopefully, to make a meaningful difference in terms of the dialogue around mental health, and I suppose in this case, particularly around mental health in the workplace, but starting to think about how we translate what we understand from a research perspective, hopefully into something that is practical and usable for those, who are really in the front line in terms of dealing with mental health and having conversations around mental health, which are, employers, line managers, leaders, coworkers. And so I sort of, thought anything that I could do to help translate and upskill and empower, the wide variety of stakeholders in the workplace to sort of change the conversation, change the work practices and working systems felt like a pretty good place to be and a pretty good way to spend a career. So I guess that's been kind of my interest and fascination since then. Whether I've achieved any of that, I don't know, but that was the aim and ambition anyways.
Yeah, I think we see that a bit of that pattern in clinical psychologists working in our field as well, and certainly a couple of members in my team are clinical psychologists, where they've sort of consistently seen people having these psychological issues due to work conditions of work, experiences at work, and feeling sort of frustrated because, yeah, while they can give them skills to cope with those issues, we know that the best approach is actually to just address the issues so that they're not causing the distress in the first place. And that sort of repeated pattern they've sort of seen in so many of their clients in clinical practice really motivated them to go, no, I actually want to go and work more upstream with organizations to actually do that sort of preventative work. So, yeah, not at all an unusual pathway.
And it's interesting because I think almost in the COVID period, that became even more profound, didn't it? Where we really sort of saw how I think environments and in case the workplace either had the opportunity to really change what they're doing in a really positive way, or it really exacerbated, I think, some ongoing issues. So, yeah, I think it really brought that in focus.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're now working in academia, Juliet. So what are your main areas of research?
At the moment, well, so broadly, everything really falls under the very broad umbrella of mental health at work. But I would say the kind of key lines that I've been working in have been one bit of that's really been around looking at line managers and how we upskill them, give them the kind of confidence and competencies around talking about mental health at work, thinking about how we manage and design jobs in a different way that we hope are sort of health enhancing. And I guess from a leadership perspective, starting to think about how do we empower the decision makers within organizations to start to think about the kind of operations management, the strategic decisions, not just in terms of the running of the business, but starting to think about that much more from a mental health and well-being perspective. So alongside the kind of management practice end, I suppose there's also a really interesting kind of discussion, reflection on from a decision maker end within an organization and how we really inject talking about mentally healthy workplaces at that really kind of strategic bit. So that's been kind of one key piece of work. I suppose the other area of a real interest for me is around disability in the workplace, and thinking about particularly disclosure around disability in the workplace. So oftentimes a lot of occupational health systems work on the premise that in order to get reasonable adjustments, workplace adaptations and accommodations necessitates and requires that employee to have to disclose, whether that's informally to a line manager or formally through HR systems or other sort of mechanisms. Um, and I think there's something that's really interesting about that in that in order to get the supports and resources that an employee may feel that they need for various different reasons requires a very sensitive discussion around something that's very personal, very sensitive. And so there's an interesting tension there, I think, about how you operationalize occupational health systems that necessitate and require a disclosure. And actually, for many workers, often that's a continual disclosure. So it's not a one off where you tell the organization and that's your adaptations and accommodations in place. But oftentimes, line managers change. And so it's almost a continual, perpetual process of having to have that conversation again and again. And you did a series of interviews a couple of years ago with about 50 employees, and most of them talked about the challenges of, and actually just the exhaustion of having to kind of almost out themselves, if you will, again and again, and to fight for adaptations and accommodations on a continuous basis. So that's sort of the other bit that's been a real sort of interest for me.
Look, I think they are two very important areas that we need more research and support in, definitely, and that translation right into practice. Funnily enough, two of our co-hosts from the UK, Kate Field and Peter Kelly, did a podcast episode not that long ago with Sarah Gashier, actually 30th of July it came out, I just looked it up now, and they were talking about invisible disabilities and how do you get people to disclose and how do you do that in a way that doesn't harm their career prospects, if you like. So I think that's so important. And then your other piece of research regarding, how do you think about the mental health of workers when you're making business decisions? I think, companies are starting to get there when we think about environmental impact of decisions, right? And how do we make good, sustainable choices for the environment? But, people have feelings, the environment doesn't. How do we make good decisions that don't affect the mental health of our employees and are sustainable for their well-being? I think that's actually a really important area of research as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so interesting. I think that the importance of expanding that discussion of sustainability, to seeing that as multi-component, and the environment obviously being a really important bit of that. But as you said, I mean, most of us will continue to work relatively late into life, and as retirement ages increase across many countries, I think we do need to sort of start to shift and change the discussion to talking about sustainable forms of working. And that's imperative both from a mental health perspective, but also from kind of a physical health perspective as well. So as you said, I think it's a really important component of kind of corporate social responsibility that I don't always think necessarily gets the same level of discourse and dialogue.
Yeah, and not to mention the downstream impacts, right, of having people who become sick at work, then they have impacts on public health systems and, can't contribute to the economy and that sort of thing. So there is those macroeconomic issues associated with that disease burden as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the cost of doing nothing or doing very little is both really significant to employers. I think sometimes they don't necessarily have a very clear view of the business case actually in terms of investing in people's mental health and well-being, but also just the society at large in terms, we lose, a significant proportion of the working population that have talents, that have uh, the opportunity to contribute in so many different ways, but by default, because of, you know, health circumstances being unfairly sort of excluded from the workplace, that may be in the short term, but for many that might be in the long term as well. So thinking about health and putting it much more at the core of, you know, not just business values, but also business strategies, I think is beneficial both for the organization, but also I think, and for workers, of course. But I think there's a real sort of public health benefit to that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to definitely link to some of your research because I think both of those topics would be of a lot of interest to our listeners on the podcast.
So the research that we invited you on to talk about today was a paper called "The Relationship Between Line Manager Training in Mental Health and Organisational Outcomes." So can we maybe start with what were the drivers behind this project?
Absolutely. So I'll give maybe a little bit of a background piece if it's useful to that particular article. So a few years ago, we were part of a regional development grant in the UK, based in the Midlands, to look at and start to test different types of interventions. And one of the key interests within that global piece of work was the kind of link between mental health and productivity. And so through that, with myself, Holly Blake at Nottingham and Louise Thompson, we developed a line manager training intervention. It was a digital intervention with the aim of sort of upskilling line managers in terms of their confidence, their competencies around mental health at work. And we evaluated that. We had really sort of successful outcomes from that. And actually, the feedback from a lot of the organizations that we were piloting it with, they said, look, this is great. This is exactly what we need. Line managers are really key. And I think that became even more apparent in COVID, again, where line managers were really at the front line of so many of those conversations around mental health. So that was really interesting to us. And we wanted to continue to develop and refine that. I suppose one of the key bits that was sort of the question mark in terms of seeing how we could really get this type of intervention integrated and embedded with organizations was how can we, if the argument is there, to sort of say, not only is this good for line managers, and we suspect it's good for employees and their mental health and their feelings at work, but actually, is there evidence to suggest that this is good for the organization? I mean, dare I say, sort of, there's a bottom line, value to this, a return on investment. And we were really fortunate that we were working with colleagues at Warwick Business School and the Enterprise Research Centre, who had this really fantastic data set where they followed, it's probably about near enough sort of 2,000 enterprises over a period of time. So they started collecting data from these enterprises, actually about 4 weeks before our first national lockdown here in the UK. So it was almost a really interesting kind of pre-COVID measure. But they have kind of followed a group of enterprises on a year-to-year basis for about 4 years now. And they asked them about all sorts of different interesting things, about productivity indicators, but also around their mental health and well-being practices. So what were they doing in their enterprises and organizations around mental health and well-being? And one of those items was around sort of line manager training and mental health. So we had a really fantastic opportunity, just because of the nature of this really unique data set, to start to ask some of these questions. Well, does offering line manager training in mental health, is that significantly associated to a wide variety of organizational outcomes? And the answer to that was, we found pretty much yes across the board. Now, the article that we looked at there, well, this is going to test my memory, which is terrible these days, but we found benefits in terms of, customer satisfaction, absence levels, et cetera. So across a number of outcomes, there were improvements. In a separate article that we've just had provisionally accepted in the Journal of Occupational Organizational Psychology, we also looked at presenteeism within these organizations. And again, we find that those organizations that offered line manager training in mental health report lower levels of presenteeism. So I think, as sort of a preliminary piece of evidence, it sort of starts to help build a really important picture, which is, does line manager training in mental health, is there value to line managers themselves? And our own research suggests yes, but I know there's, Amy Guyad and others have also been doing research in this space. And again, their research indicates that, much the same argument, it is beneficial for line managers. There's building evidence that it has almost like a transfer effect to those that they manage. And so there's value there. But I think we hope that this is kind of a first piece in the puzzle to say, actually, there's benefits to organizations themselves. And so this should really provide, we hope, the beginning of a really useful rationale to say investing in this type of training, this kind of leadership development initiative makes good business sense. It's a strategic business decision, as well as it being, core and important from a mental health and well-being perspective.
So you were sort of looking at like a binary, either they're delivering training or not, and not so much looking at like the content of the training or the subject matter or those types of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So the variable we had to use within this data set was, as you said, it was binary. It was either they offer it or they don't offer it. So on one level, while that's useful, it's also very limited, because the reality is, we know if you look at sort of intervention literature, it's not just about the delivery, it's also about the perception of that intervention as viewed by the recipients. So I suspect, and unfortunately because we didn't have that variable within the data set, but I suspect that the nature and the content of that intervention, as well as how it is perceived and received by those recipients, potentially plays a really important, maybe moderating factor or mediating factor. I suspect it will facilitate that relationship even further. So my kind of interpretation of what we found is at a very basic level, either you offer it or you don't offer it. Well, the offering it seems considerably better than the alternative not offering it. But I think the next step to that is then to really start to explore that piece around the kind of content of it, the delivery of it, how it's viewed and received by those participating in that intervention, to see how or if that kind of further influences that relationship. I mean, I would kind of think that it probably makes it stronger, that it makes it more beneficial. But I mean, that remains to be seen, and probably is an important next step in terms of that empirical piece.
Yeah, and definitely I think from that content perspective, right? Like, are we delivering training in like signs and symptoms of mental ill health and different types of mental ill health, and what are the, pathways and that sort of thing? Or is it that, and here's how you can respond to these things if you see team members experiencing these types of signs and symptoms? And it can kind of go beyond that as well. Like, what are the things that you can do as a leader to accommodate your team? Like, there's so many build-ons from that foundational, here's what mental health is, and here's what ill health is, and here's how you might notice if something wasn't quite right. So yeah, a lot of variability in there, probably even in the content of those different packages that were actually offered. Yeah.
This is it. I mean, I know from our own development kind of work around line manager training, I think one of the things that we often observe from those within the published literature, and that's not even saying there's obviously a huge range that's probably not within the published literature that have been evaluated, is what we felt was really lacking is moving the discourse and dialogue away from just, well, what is mental health, and that kind of symptom and sign recognition, to sort of say, though that's really important, but it's also important for us to think about the management competencies around work-related stress, about how we talk about how we design and manage people's jobs. And the other thing that was probably interesting, because when we developed the intervention as a co-creation piece, the feedback we had from line managers themselves was, you can't give what you don't have. And so for them, they felt a really important bit of that training was also about, how do I take care of my own mental health, my own well-being, to ensure that I have the kind of resources and the capacity to then make sure that I'm in a position to provide the best kind of support, guidance, mentorship, et cetera, to those that I manage and lead. So for us, when we were developing it, we kind of went with a sort of a 5-model structure, where we had a bit on self-care, we had some on mental health literacy and awareness, how to have conversations around mental health, how we design and manage jobs in a way to kind of ensure mental health and well-being. We talked about psychological safety, and then kind of competencies around work-related stress. in hopes that we're sort of looking at that from a more comprehensive picture. But as you said, there's a huge amount of variability within that training initiative. That's important to kind of recognize and think about how that then translates in terms of outcomes, whether that be individual, line manager, or organizational.
Yeah, definitely promising though that just purely the presence of this type of training is having a net positive effect though. So yeah, not to encourage organizations to just do the bare minimum, but it looks like even if that is what they're doing, it's still definitely better than not doing anything at all.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the FlourishDX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow FlourishDX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the FlourishDX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode. But tell us about your methodology first of all, Juliet. How did you structure this?
So for this paper specifically, so that's probably I'll sort of answer that question two ways. I mean, one of which is because it was sort of a secondary data analysis, we were sort of using a data set that had been developed by colleagues at Warwick. So I'll try my humble best to give a flavor of their methodology. But essentially what they have done is, on a year-by-year basis, they've gone out and recruited organizations from the Midlands here in the UK and have interviewed the person in the organization that is sort of effectively in charge of health and well-being. So that might be the kind of senior HR person, that might be somebody with a specific title in health and well-being. For smaller organizations, that might be the employer themselves. So that person potentially varied on who was interviewed, but the primary role was one around sort of health and well-being within that organization. And so they asked a variety of questions around, mental health and well-being practices, and then things to do with productivity, presenteeism, absenteeism, workplace innovation, those sort of things. So within the context of our paper, we utilize that kind of binary variable of do you or don't you offer it, and then looked at whether or not there was relationships with that in terms of a variety of different sort of outcomes, self-reported sickness absence. I think one was customer satisfaction and so on. So basically controlling for a variety of different variables within that, just to see if that relationship exists and in the direction that we had anticipated or that might be the case.
Yeah, great. And you, I think you mentioned earlier that you also looked at presenteeism as one of the factors.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so that's in a different article.
Okay.
Because we had a variety of different variables in that. But yes, we have also looked at presenteeism. And again, we find that there is, by offering line manager training in mental health, that does seem to be associated with a decrease in presenteeism.
So can you take us through, I guess you've given us a summary of the findings. Can you take us through some more detailed findings?
In anything in particular?
Whatever was interesting. Any surprises?
To be honest, what was surprising is that they were all significant across the board. I mean, I guess maybe I had anticipated that some relationships may be significant and others not, but that there does seem to be quite a kind of cohesive narrative there, which is by providing this provision in mental health within the context of the workplace, that does seem to be related to these organizational level outcomes in various different ways. I mean, I think one of the things that's quite interesting in that, and something that I guess we're going to do as a sort of a separate piece to this, is it's important to remember that these variables are reported by organizations themselves. So we're sort of measuring at the enterprise level. And so with that, there becomes lots of sort of interesting questions about how this sort of translates and almost the mechanisms that help us understand these relationships in more kind of depth and detail. Now, I'm probably going to say this naturally because I'm a psychologist, and I'm sure there's lots of other disciplines that would go, oh no, but this is interesting too. But for me, I think what the interesting piece there is it from the employee perspective, because I think it's through the employee perspective that we begin to understand how this relationship translates and sort of unfolds over time. Um, and so what we've been really lucky through this kind of program of work, that some of the organizations that participated in this enterprise survey, we were able to do employee level surveys with them. And so that becomes a really interesting sort of data set because we have an understanding of sort of enterprise level metrics, but we have um, perceptions and measurements at the employee level around a variety of different things. So we have measurements on the psychosocial safety climate, on working conditions, on their own perceptions about their performance at work, their motivation, and their overall well-being. So there becomes perhaps sort of something interesting to look at what's happening at the interface between what the enterprise is seeing and reporting to what an employee is experiencing and reporting, and how those are kind of working dynamically, probably over time, to help us understand what's driving productivity related outcomes. Um, and I think for me, it almost sits in that narrative. We kind of assume that a happy worker is a productive worker, that kind of classic happy worker hypothesis. And we know that that's such a very complex relationship between mental health and productivity, both for employees themselves, but also certainly how that then translates at the kind of enterprise and organizational level. Um, and so for me, I feel like from this paper and from other pieces of work we've been doing in the background, I think it's really about to understand the link between mental health and productivity outside just line manager training, but as a global idea and set of provisions that an organization might offer. I think we have to sort of dive into those complex relationships a little bit more to understand what's happening at the interface between, the individual, their team, to the organization, and so on.
Yeah, so you've been able to engage with some of those organizations then and start to delve into some of that that interface stuff.
This is it. So, I mean, we're still kind of in the field at the moment collecting data, but we've been, I think, really fortunate that we've been able to collect some quantitative data from employees. But we've also been working with those organizations to do some interviews. So we've got a lovely kind of building data set that gives us both, hopefully, breadth and depth of understanding of that kind of um, how do we understand the relationship between mental health and productivity? How is that unfolding? How is that being shaped and influenced?
Yeah, well, we will be very interested to see those results once you get through all of the data crunching and writing and
No,
reviewing.
I concur. I mean, it's a question we get asked all the time from our clients because we've built this ROI calculator that will help companies to determine, what is the cost of, presenteeism, absenteeism, productivity losses due to, mental health issues or psychosocial hazard exposure. And one of the things we've got in there is burnout, and what is the productivity decrease that you'd likely see from someone who is burnt out versus someone who's not burnt out. And surprisingly enough, there's actually not much, if any, good research out there that makes a direct link between burnout and productivity. And in fact, we even reached out to Dr. Michael Leiter. Thanks again, Michael, for coming to our inaugural PHS conference as well. And, he's one of the, him and Christina, two of the people behind burnout research. And, he's unaware of any really good data that like links burnout with reductions in productivity and the ROI associated with curbing that, right? So, yeah, no, keep doing what you're doing and please share. I mean, at the moment, we're having to look at our own data sets, but it's much better to see something that's peer reviewed and out there in public.
Yeah, I mean, I think in about 2012, I did a report with the European Agency for Safety and Health at Work, and our aim in that report was to look at and review the economic evidence around psychosocial hazards and mental health at work, whether that was from like a societal level. So, what does it cost governments, policymakers? What does it cost organizations? And I suppose what is the, if you will, the human cost in terms of from an employee perspective. And honestly, at that point, there wasn't a lot, So now we're 10 plus years on. It's better, but the reality is, I think that wider discourse that helps us understand, what that cost is and trying to kind of quantify it, in business terms, but also, dare I say, sort of people terms as well, is still needing growth. And I think what's interesting, I think from an employer perspective, understandably, these metrics matter. I think it starts a conversation in a meaningful way when you start to talk about, investing in people isn't just good for, your employee, which it ultimately is, but actually it's beneficial to the organization in all of these various different ways. So, yeah, I think there's a really interesting, I think a really interesting and really important piece, which is about trying to really build together a much more cohesive sort of evidence base around that mental health and productivity piece. That becomes, I hope, an interesting launch pad in terms of discussions with policymakers and employers about, well, what are we doing, but what more can we be doing or should we be doing to really push this forward?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because there has been, just looking at mental health in general, there has been many attempts by, PwC, Deloitte's of the world and that sort of thing, right, to put an ROI on workplace mental health interventions. So it's not like it hasn't been done. I haven't found that many organisations are really buying it though, or really changing their practices, going, oh, look what sort of ROI we can get. It's still the people who feel willing to move because of the moral kind of obligation to, not harm people. But I think if we can give credible data as well regarding the ROI, it kind of just, like you say, it creates a better business case for beyond like just doing the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing.
And I think there's something that's, I mean, it's interesting. I suppose in the workplace health literature, we've seen it a bit more at the individual level, but I think it applies to sort of employers where you sort of think about people, for example, if you offer a gym, most of the people who use gyms in the workplaces probably would go to a gym anyways. And I think it's totally true of employers, having a conversation, the people who are wanting to come to those webinars and seminars about mental health and well-being are organizations that already are probably interested and engaged about what can we do, what more can we do, and and the social value of doing that for their workers rather than just exclusively the economic value of doing it. I think what becomes really important is thinking about how we engage employers who aren't interested. Now, I suppose we're probably assuming that the business case is a strong one in terms of opening that door around that discourse and dialogue, and maybe it is. But I also wonder whether or not it's also about thinking about that in a more creative space in terms of what other ways, what other discussion points or evidence base become really important in terms of trying to open that conversation for employers who perhaps are a little less interested in terms of mental health and well-being in the workplace.
Yeah, and that we're seeing definitely firsthand in Australia that the legal kind of ramifications now with new and much stronger regulations in Australia for psychosocial risk management. That's definitely, something getting companies moving. And then the reputational risk of, being called out by regulators or in the media for not doing the right thing. So reputational risk and the legal requirements are definitely something. But yeah, it would be interesting to see, what is the perfect mix to get companies to move in the right way and do it in a way that doesn't just tick a box, but actually creates meaningful changes to employees on the front line. Hey, yeah, really, really important research and really interesting. And I guess the last question I had for you was, what action would you love to see as a result of this research?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. um, I guess, I mean, I hope um, that it keeps the conversation going or it opens up conversations from not just a researcher perspective, um, but actually thinking about, are these conversations, does it help support conversations within an organization themselves in terms of, okay, well, what are we doing What's the value of that? How does that fit with our kind of business values, ethics, approach, etc.? I mean, that would be fantastic, I think, in many ways, is if it makes or it shifts some conversation within organizations themselves would be brilliant.
Yeah. No, yeah, the more we can have these conversations and, be able to pull on different pieces of information, the better. Yeah. Joelle, did you have any follow-ups? No? Blown away. Hey, no, I'm actually really interested in a lot of areas of your research, Juliet. We might actually have to come get you back on at some point for like a research rundown like we did with Tony, to talk about some of your other research on those other two areas that you said were really key. But I guess at this point of the podcast, one of the questions we like to ask all our guests is, if you were to look into the future and think about what workplace mental health will look like, what are your hopes for the future?
Oh gosh, again, that's a really good question. I think what I hope is that we start to see health and well-being um, as an evolving learning strategy. So I suppose one of the things that we think about for organizations, it's not just about doing one thing and going, right, tick, I've done it, boom, that's it, mic drop. We've dealt with mental health, but actually it's about evolving. It's about organizations being adaptable, flexible, and responsive to hearing about the nature of working conditions, which, as we know, are changing with AI and technology and hybrid working and all these sort of things. So I think if I hope that if we take this idea of adaptation and accommodation, that actually that's really applicable in terms of organizational behavior as much as it is about individual level behavior. And so having continuous dialogues and discussions that talk about where are we at, what more can we do, what other challenges are we facing, that it becomes a really inherent problem solving cycle at all sorts of levels, not just in terms of employees or conversations with line managers, employees, but also really at strategic organizational levels. So for me, that would be fantastic to see that really dynamic learning and evolution process be at the heart of how organizations think about health and well-being, and that it's an evolution and it's a development. It's not an end goal as such. You continue to strive to do more, to do better. Would be fantastic. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, I think that's terrific. In fact, I saw someone comment on that regarding safety. Safety is not like an end state. It's an ongoing process, right? And it's about continuous improvement. So I think that's perfectly aligned with what you're saying there regarding, you're never done with mental health. It's always going back and going, how are we faring? What could we be doing better? And implementing both individual and organizational level interventions.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think as an individual level, that's something that's everybody's on that mental health journey in terms of reflecting and learning of how am I feeling today? What more do I need? What things do I need to think about? I guess what we're hoping is that organizations also take that same kind of reflective and responsive paradigm.
Yeah, and I'd love to see them be more responsive, rather than just, like responding to a once a year, like employee survey, for example. Going, well, what are the methods we have for constant dialogue and responsiveness as issues arise, or to get ahead of issues as well. So, no, I think we're well aligned, Juliet. You should probably listen to some episodes on this podcast to talk
I'm
about
going
these
to.
things regularly.
You might like it, yeah.
I'm diving in. I really am.
We'll send you some recommendations.
Yeah, what a cutting plan, Joelle. We'll just keep inviting guests, and
That's
one
it.
by one, we'll get
We'll
them
grow
listening to
our
the
listeners
podcast.
one guest at a time. This is the path to world domination. Last question for you today, Julia. Do you have any words of advice for listeners who are interested in working in this field of psychological health and safety?
Oh gosh, another good question. I mean, I suppose there's so many wonderful professional associations which I think start to give a really useful platform. I mean, here in Europe, we've got the European Academy for Occupational Health Psychology. There's lots of interesting ways to kind of get involved within that. Of course, there's also sort of the American contingent. I know there's wonderful associations in Australia and New Zealand as well. Um, so I think probably, what I have found about this community is everybody just is very welcoming and fundamentally wants more and more people to get involved within this area. But I'm going to be perhaps bold and say within this movement. And so I guess I would just encourage, if you're interested in getting into this field, reach out to individuals who are working or researching in this field, because I think as a community it's very receptive and wants to provide opportunities, whether that be networking or knowledge. So just reach out, really.
Yep. Certainly we're always receptive when people want to talk to us about what we're doing, and I know that's the case for many other people in our network as well. So yeah, I agree. People are very very friendly, mostly.
Nice. Well, Juliet, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your research. And like I said, hopefully we'll have you back again at some point. And where can people find out more about your research besides the journal article link, which we'll put in the show notes?
Oh gosh, now, well, I guess my website page on Queen's University Belfast, but I'm trying to get better about being like sharing stuff on LinkedIn. So I will try to be better about sharing stuff on LinkedIn. But yeah, that's probably that. And maybe the third is just, again, just encourage people, if anybody's interested, please reach out, send me an email. Happy to have, a conversation and or to kind of suggest, bits and pieces of research that may be interesting to sort of have a look at.
And just a semi-regular reminder to listeners that if you're interested in a paper, you don't have to pay the publisher. You can email the author and ask for a copy, and they'll be delighted to send it to you.
Yes, that one trick that all publishers hate. Nice. All right. Well, thanks again, Juliet. Listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. So remember, we do record these over video when we have our guests on, so you can check out the videos on the FlourishTX YouTube channel. We also take the best bits on our and put them onto the FlourishTX LinkedIn page, so go over there and check them out. And while you're on LinkedIn, Joelle and I are frequent there. Juliet is making a promise to spend more time on LinkedIn, but it sounds like email is probably going to be the best way to continue the conversation with Juliet. But that's it for today. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow FlourishTX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.